Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a really fascinating look at the significant challenges facing the United States. We've gathered a stack of insightful sources that, they delve pretty deep into its social fabric and political landscape.
That's right. And our mission for this deep dive, it's really to go beyond just, well, listing the pressing issues. We want to understand the underlying forces at play within the political system, the complex role economic crises can take, and what happens when national attention gets pulled, in all sorts of different directions. Ultimately, we'll unpack what this means for you as a citizen and also for the global stage.
Okay, so with that mission in mind, our sources immediately dive into some pretty stark realities. So, what do they identify as the major economic and social pressures the U.S. is grappling with right now?
Well, the analysis in these materials, it highlights several critical areas,
Mhm.
and they're deeply intertwined. We're talking about a widening gap between the rich and the poor, the persistent struggle with healthcare, access and affordability,
Mhm.
also the immense burden of high education debt, a noticeable erosion of the middle class, and a weakening system of retirement and Social Security.
Right.
And what's crucial here is that these aren't just isolated issues. They form a kind of complex web. A breakdown in one area, it quickly impacts the others. It creates this feedback loop that's, well, arguably harder to disrupt than many realize.
Yeah, that makes sense. And here's where it gets really interesting, at least for me, this idea that whether reform is even possible. It kind of hinges on the very structure of the U.S. political system itself. Is it, built to help us find solutions, or does it more often just get in the way?
It's a complex picture, definitely, offering both pathways and roadblocks according to the sources we've looked at. On one hand, you do have factors that can support reform. The flexibility of the federal system, for instance, that allows states to innovate, to test new policies locally. A great example that's often cited is Massachusetts' health insurance system, which was kind of a blueprint even before the National Affordable Care Act.
Oh, yeah, the Romney Care precursor.
Exactly. And there's also the demonstrable power of an active civil society and media. Public pressure can genuinely guide policy sometimes. We've seen it with some minimum wage increases or even certain green taxes.
Okay, so there are mechanisms for positive change, but what about those formidable obstacles that often seem to dominate the headlines, the things that make people feel stuck?
Yeah, that's where the picture gets considerably more challenging. We see acute partisan polarization
Hmm.
that often leads to a deeply divided Congress that, well, it really struggles to pass major legislation. It's gridlock.
Hmm.
Then there's the immense influence of lobbying groups. Major corporations, insurance companies, banks.
Hmm.
They exert tremendous pressure to avoid taxes or regulation.
Right.
And critically, there's the dominance of money in politics. Campaign funding from economic elites. It can lead many politicians to be, frankly, more loyal to their donors than to their voters. And you have to wonder then, can meaningful change truly happen under these conditions?
That picture of polarization and lobbying influence sounds pretty grim. Do these sources offer any specific examples of reforms that did manage to break through despite those odds, even small ones? Or is it mostly just a story of blockage?
Well, they do point to instances where public pressure, especially during a crisis, can force movement, which actually leads perfectly into our next point. Do these big problems, these crises, actually force change? Or can they sometimes be used to, well, avoid it?
Ah, that's a great transition. It's almost like a crisis could either be the moment things have to shift or maybe an excuse to double down on inaction, right? What's the take here?
Well, the material shows that economic crises can certainly create pressure for reform. That much is clear. For instance, uh, growing public pressure around the student debt crisis. That has forced some states and even the president to offer partial solutions like, payment freezes or some debt relief.
Okay.
The COVID-19 pandemic, obviously, it clearly exposed the fragility of the healthcare system. That led to emergency spending just to shore it up.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the rising cost of living, I mean, that makes reforms like housing support and increased wages feel politically necessary because citizens feel the direct impact in their wallets.
So crises can be a catalyst. But you mentioned a flip side earlier.
Indeed, there's definitely a flip side. These very same crises can also be used as a pretext for austerity. Budget deficits, for example, they are sometimes leveraged as an excuse to cut public support programs rather than expanding them, especially when certain neoliberal currents, those economic philosophies favoring deregulation and reduced government spending, when those hold sway.
Right, using the deficit as the reason not to act.
Exactly. So the mere existence of a crisis, it doesn't automatically guarantee progressive reform. Not at all. It really depends on the political will and the dominant ideology at that moment.
It makes you wonder, though, if these issues like healthcare costs, education debt, Social Security, if they're so pressing, why isn't there a more focused public demand for solutions? One of our sources brings up a really provocative idea. What if the public is being, like, systematically distracted from these core issues?
This is a critical point that the material really highlights.
Hmm.
It argues that the American public is being systematically distracted, that's the term used, by side issues.
Mm.
So instead of focusing on fundamental problems like, say, a crumbling public education system or rising healthcare costs, the looming collapse of Social Security, or the weakening of community welfare, national attention, it suggests, gets hijacked by cultural skirmishes, political drama, and viral outrage.
Like culture war stuff.
Precisely. Think about the obsessive debates around, I don't know, book bans, flags, celebrity scandals, political insults, things that often dominate the media cycle, right?
Yeah, they definitely get a lot of airtime. It almost sounds like a deliberate fog of war, doesn't it? As a listener, you start to wonder if we're all just chasing shiny objects while the real issues quietly escalate in the background.
Exactly. And what's argued here is that this isn't accidental. It's presented as a deliberate diversion. While citizens are busy fighting these, symbolic battles, real wealth and power are allegedly being consolidated by the richest few. Policy agendas get written behind closed doors. Lobbyists make decisions while the public argues on social media. That's the picture painted.
Wow.
And the stark result, as our analysis describes it, is, well, a democracy that serves capital more than citizens. A system that listens more to billionaires than to nurses or teachers, leading potentially to a future that looks less like a republic and more like an oligarchy.
An oligarchy. That's strong language.
It is. And the danger here isn't just economic inequality, which is bad enough. It's what's termed civic erosion. When people stop discussing issues that truly matter, like education, healthcare, retirement, social equity, they stop voting for solutions. They become divided, distracted, and eventually silent.
That's a powerful and frankly, yeah, a bit unsettling assessment. Now, you listening might be wondering, okay, what does the state of U.S. democracy have to do with me, maybe if I'm outside the U.S. or just with the wider world? Why should this matter beyond America's borders?
Well, the sources really emphasize this point, that the decline of democratic and social principles in the United States, given its immense global influence, it has far-reaching consequences beyond its borders. That's a direct quote. This is especially true, they argue, for poorer nations that already grapple with deep-rooted political, social, and economic instability. When global leadership, particularly from a historically influential nation like the U.S., weakens in upholding justice and equity, while these vulnerable societies are often the ones who pay the highest price, the ripple effects are considerable.
So it's not just an internal U.S. issue, it has global implications.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so after exploring all these challenges and complexities, the systemic roadblocks, even this idea of deliberate distraction, is there actually hope for reform? What conditions, if any, do the sources suggest would make change possible? Or are we just stuck?
No, not necessarily stuck. Reform is indeed possible, but the conditions laid out are significant. They're demanding. It requires what's described as a broad, popular, plus political alliance, something like what happened during the New Deal era, that kind of coalition.
The tent coalition.
Exactly. It also necessitates breaking the grip of money on politics, perhaps through stricter campaign finance regulation or, other structural changes. That's seen as key. And finally, it often takes a major crisis, a crisis so profound it forces real reform, similar to how the Great Depression led to Roosevelt's significant changes.
So basically, a collective awakening and a serious breaking of old habits, often prompted by a big enough shock to the system.
Precisely. That seems to be the pattern identified. And conversely, the analysis suggests reform is seriously threatened if partisan division remains as acute as it is, if lobbying groups continue to control decision-making unchecked, or if public awareness is absent, if collective battles remain focused on secondary issues rather than these core national concerns. It's presented as a very stark choice, really.
What a journey. I mean, through the intricate layers of challenges, the political dynamics, and the powerful role of public attention, or maybe lack of attention in the U.S., it really makes you think about where our collective energy is being directed as a society, doesn't it?
Exactly. And the sources, they leave us with a powerful call to action, essentially. It says we can shift the conversation. We can ask better questions. We can demand that the media, our politicians, and even ourselves refocus on what truly matters. Because if we don't, we risk losing not just opportunity, but democracy itself.
A profound thought to leave you with, indeed. And something certainly worth mulling over. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.